Welcome everybody to our session on ESOPs. The first thing I wanted to do was mention that this is going to be recorded. So normally our programming is not recorded at the Family Business Center. However, we're going to record this one. It's a little different than our breakfast series in that we're approaching this one more as a educational type of resource that we want our families to be able to go back to in case they miss something that was said today, especially about, tax implications, legal issues, things like that. And they don't want to have to pay an attorney to get that. They can get it for free from here. So, Drew, Matt.
I've been trying to reject the recording, but apparently I'm just going to accept it.
No, that isn't going to happen. Okay. So we are recording. And the other thing I wanted to address is why ESOPs? We're the Family Business Center. Why are we pushing ESOPs? First of all, we're not pushing ESOPs, but I think ESOPs in the right place are a great option for families, especially when you're looking at succession planning and liquidity needs and things like that for a company, or you're looking at maybe it's employee retention tool, things like that. I think that Drew and Nick and others will probably talk a little bit more about the positive side of why a family business might consider a partial ESOP. So we're not really exactly pushing the full-on ESOP, of course, but with Robert here today, he can talk more about how a partial ESOP has worked amazingly for their family business for quite a long time. So anyway, with that, I'm going to introduce Deb Giarusso. She is from the faculty in the finance department here at UNI and has been running our employee ownership programming at UNI, which is a separate center than ours. And so her focus is exactly in this area, which is why we wanted to bring her and some of her folks in for this to do a better job of kind of educational and firsthand perspective on ESOP. So Deb, I'll let you take over, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you, Dan. As Dan said, I work with the Iowa Center for Employee Ownership. And if you're not familiar with our center, I would not be surprised. We launched about a year ago, and our focus is supporting the economic vitality and prosperity in Iowa, primarily by advocating for broad-based employee ownership models. We recognize that employee ownership, various types that include partial ESOPs that we're talking about today, can be a viable strategy for business owners, including family businesses that are going through a transition. And so our objectives today in this webinar are, one, to build awareness of what and how employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs, work, provide you with that basic knowledge of what occurs during a transition, due diligence, how you implement conversion to a partial ESOP, and how you ensure or increase sustainable success from making that change. And then finally, provide you with the knowledge, the information to connect with resources if you want to further explore the ESOP options. So I'd like to, at this time, allow our knowledgeable and experienced panelists, Drew, Nick, and Robert, to each introduce themselves. And I'll start with Nick.
Good morning or afternoon. I guess I got to look at the clock before I say that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Nick Viner. I'm a vice president at Prairie Capital. Prairie Capital has offices across the country, and we work with firms primarily in the ownership transition space, and just helping companies, owners assess the type of decisions that we're going to be talking about today.
Drew, you're next on my screen.
Excellent. My name is Drew Larson. I'm a partner and attorney at the Brown Winnick Law Firm and serve on our management team. I've been there 15 years now. I primarily serve as a sort of general and corporate counsel to businesses in many different industries, primarily closely held businesses. And I do a lot of work with them on transitioning, whether it's family transitions, ESOP sales, and transactions, or potentially third-party sales to private equity or other buyers. So, but yeah, I'm the generalist in the business space for the most part, but have sort of fallen in love with the family transition and ESOP models, and work with a ton of those type of clients. And it's also, there's no air in our building right now. So by the way, I don't normally just wear a t-shirt, but I tried to stay on theme with the Ask Me About ESOPs t-shirt. But if I look like I'm melting, that is why it's about 87 in this room. And my Scandinavian heritage is really looking for about 65.
Thank you, Drew. Robert?
Robert Kramer, Kramer Associates. We're kind of a medium-sized bridge construction company out of Grimes. We do work all around Iowa, a little bit surrounding states. We have 3 Kramer families that own about 20% each, and then the ESOP owns about 40%. So the employees do. So we'll tell a bit more as we go along, but it's been a long-term plan to have the employees gain in the ESOP, and it's been a very positive experience for us in changing our culture. So looking forward to talking about it.
Thank you. So as we begin our discussion today, I just wanted to say a couple of things about the ESOP model, and depending on how much you're aware of the model. So the majority of the ESOPs in the US have been established by profitable, closely held companies, in many ways to provide liquidity for those transitioning owners. And so if I were to summarize an ESOP in one sentence, I would probably say that an ESOP is a qualified retirement benefit plan that purchases company shares in trust for employees. So as we head into this discussion, I'd like to initiate it with asking our panelists based on their experience, what questions they would recommend a business owner to ask prior to considering a transition at the very early stage, maybe when they're thinking about it and wanting to make a change in the next 3 to 5 years. What questions should they be asking upfront of themselves and their advisors as they look at what options are out there, and certainly partial ESOPs being one of those options?
So I'll jump in to just open
Yeah.
a little bit. One thing that I think is really important before you talk to an advisor is to try and sit down and at least think through where you would like to end up. Because sometimes what happens is we see people when they start to explore, they haven't really thought through it, and they go to an advisor, and if that advisor has a specialty in one particular type of, say, transition option, oftentimes that's where you can get shepherded into completing the transition through, or that's the process that you end up using, because that's who you trust. And that's once you start down these processes, excuse me, there's a lot of inertia to simply keep going. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to do before you even get to a point where you're talking to an advisor is just think through, if I could get to exactly where I want to be with this, what does it look like? Does that mean I'm out of the business? Does that mean my son or daughter is running the business? Does that mean another family member is coming in? Would I like to retain family ownership? Would I not? Do I want to retain some? Would I not? And just start to work through that a little bit. You don't have to have any answers for how to accomplish any of those things, but just start to think about where you might want to end up.
I'll echo Nick a little bit. An ESOP, like any other transition structure, is a tool. It's only valuable if it gets you to your goals. And often it's hard. I know that a lot of the webinars we've been talking about are helping set those goals, the reflection about what the goal is. Is the goal, we just need liquidity. So we're choosing an ESOP as a menu of, say, liquidity options for owners. Is it, we really believe we want to have incentives for the employees. Like, we think employee ownership is a cultural and economic, like, this company's been good to us, we want to reward them. Is that our goal, right? Like, those are different approaches, and it's going to lead you down different paths, most likely, in whether an ESOP is a fit for you, what other options might exist, and how you sort of choose among them on a go-forward basis. And I bet Robert's been through this question, so I'd be curious what he thinks.
Well, it's interesting. I was 11 years old when we became an ESOP. So, but
so you were deeply involved.
Yeah. So in 1978, Kramer Brothers was a union C Corp corporation, and my dad and his brothers started Kramer Associates as an ESOP and a non-union company. So it's a pretty big shift. But I do remember my dad saying this quite often, is that he said, if you'll look at an ESOP as a giveaway, you'll be very happy with it. If you're just looking at it as a way to like save on taxes, he goes, you might not be happy in the long term. So what we mean by that is in 78, they started making contributions to the plan. So it came out of the company, money went into the plan in the name of the employees. And over time, that grew to where now it's about 40% owners. Well, every dollar that goes into that retirement plan belongs to one of the employees. Now we management members are in there too. We have a nice nest egg, but just realize that that money does belong to somebody, and so it can be a good tool to use down the road. But if you look at it that way, you're going to be very happy with it. The other question I would ask is control. Who's going to control the company? And in our case, we stayed, the ESOP still this many years later is at 40%. And so really there isn't a control issue. The board of the company still makes the decisions and has input from the bank that we're using to manage the ESOP, but we're not, control is not a problem. But I think that'd be a question I would want to ask on the front end.
Robert, just as a follow-up, your company and your dad and his brothers made that decision to go with an ESOP very early in the process. The legislation to put in place the ESOP plans were earlier in the 70s through the Department of Labor. What was their primary motivation for choosing a model that there wasn't a lot of experience and a lot of other companies that had gone that route prior to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe it was just as they started to hear presentations on what an ESOP is, they really liked the concept of employee owners, and they like this ability to put away money tax deferred, and it could grow in there tax deferred and really have a good impact on people's retirement. So when it came to, you think about being a union contractor, and it's us versus them, it's management versus employees. Now all of a sudden we're making all the employees owners, and so we're all on the same page. And that's that culture part that is a really big key to the success of ESOP, is especially now that, and a lot of our employees have large nest eggs. They understand the benefit of, hey, the quicker we get this job done, the more money the company makes, the better my ESOP does. So that's a lot different than, hey, I'm not going to touch that because I'm a laborer. That's a carpenter's job. We just don't hear any of that kind of stuff.
And I think that's important, is successful ESOPs, whether partial or full. Look, the tax stuff, Robert already mentioned, right? If it's just the tax, you may not be in love with it, but some people do. They do it just because it's, as an owner, they think there's various benefits themselves. The most successful ESOPs are the ones that lean into the employee ownership model, where those interests are aligned, like Robert mentioned, and trying to drive engagement by employees and those kinds of things. And that takes a commitment by leadership and the family members, if it's a partial, who are going to stay in it, to encourage that kind of culture. Because, for example, I'm guessing Kramer didn't have to, right? They retained control. They could have just said it's business as usual. This is just a 401k, right? Effectively. But that doesn't sound like how you've done it. And I would like to think that's led to better results for you.
Yeah, it definitely has. In our world, in bridge construction, every single job we get, we have to be the low bidder. So to be the low bidder, we're buying the same materials, using the same subcontractors, but our people have to be able to do the job, quicker or more efficiently than our competition. So that's why labor is just so huge in our business. And I think our employees do get it now. If it takes a half hour to go back to my pickup to get my tools, and that's going to waste a half hour of labor, they now understand, okay, boy, I better do that in 5 minutes, because that's going to help the job. And then it's allowed us to be more competitive, to do the harder jobs, and to be more profitable.
A couple others that I would put on the table just for things to consider. Robert, Drew, curious to hear your thoughts, are just, do you have the ability for someone to step up to lead the business, can really start to change the tables Robert, I'd be curious how you guys have thought about that a little bit, because obviously we're generations deep into your story at this point for leadership. And then also, does the business require capital? And then some options for transition bring capital to the table, and some options do not. They may provide liquidity to current owners, but they don't bring capital to the business. And so I think that's another thing when we're talking about transition that is really important to think about up front. So Robert, I would be curious as how you guys have thought about transition a little bit with the family component of the legacy for the minority ownership here, and kind of where the management team was when you made the decision to not sell completely, but to make a partial transition.
Yeah, so we went through one transition in the year 2000. At that time, there were my dad and two brothers that were left. And what's interesting, I told the story that, you know, I graduated from Iowa State in 1990. My dad graduated from Iowa State in 1950. He's 40 years older. So that means when I graduated in 1990, he's 62. You know, so he's already thinking transition, and I'm thinking I'm just getting out of college. So it was 10 years later, it was in 2000 that my cousin and I became co-president, and we had a plan for the three brothers to retire, to work out. And it ended up being a good time. Those of you from around Central Iowa know that from 2000 to 2006 was when I-235 got totally reconstructed. And so that was a time when we kind of grew as a business. And so the brothers were happy with the transition, but we really didn't need capital. They were leaving their stock in. They were just, and as an S Corp, you know, we were able to give them a good return on their investment as we were growing and having a good profitable time. So we didn't need it that time. Well, then now, fast forward to 2024, my cousin and I are kind of transitioning out. And there again, don't really need the capital right now, because we're going to keep our stock in. So we haven't really had that need yet. Now, as far as money, I would say it's definitely offered a sense of peace to know that money is there, and any shareholder could have gone out, you know, if they wanted to. And what that is a really positive thing in your culture as well. When people feel trapped, you know, in their business, it's not good, and things can go south pretty quickly. So I think just having that confidence of knowing we had a good buy sell between our shareholders, you know, knowing they could get out at any time and use the ESOP price, which means, because we're getting an appraisal every year on our stock value. So we have a fair price there that we can use if anybody ever wanted to get out. And then we were just fortunate enough that nobody wanted to get out. So it made a good positive thing.
So as we talk about transition options that are viable, I just want to play the counter argument a little bit in terms of what conditions make a ESOP preferred and what conditions would make an ESOP less of a viable option. For example, you know, what is your key management teams? Are they staying? Are they in transition? Control issues, etc. I don't know, Nick or Drew, would you like to start off with a response?
I can start this one. Yeah. So I like to tell people an ESOP does not solve your business's problems, right? So like, if you're like, hey, I want to, if it was Robert and he was the only owner and he's looking to leave and he's got no one to take over for him, but he wants to retire, the ESOP doesn't magically make there another person to help run the business, right? So well-run, like ESOPs are really viable for companies that are stable, have invested in what I'll say transitioning real management, whether it's to other family members or other non-family members inside the business, but it needs to have a functioning management team. Other times, like there are some owners, and I run across this less in the Midwest, but the way that pricing is done is in ESOPs is it means that you get a fair value. So no one's getting hosed on these deals, but you're not necessarily going to get the very highest price you could get if you took your company to market, for example, and sold it to private equity. This assumes that the family, you know, is not interested. The family's decided to sell. So you sort of have to decide that you're willing to take a good price, but maybe not the very best price on certain ESOP transactions. Now, why would people do that? Often they care deeply about the legacy of the business in the community. So it's not true of every ESOP, but a lot of times the ESOPs I work with, they are the primary employer in their community, whatever that community is. And the other primary employers are often reliant on them in some ways and the bodies they bring to the community to support. So it's the school or the healthcare provider that if the manufacturer or someone like that isn't there, there's no point in having the school or the healthcare. And so a lot of times those owners see this as a way of giving back to the community, helps ensure, if they've decided they need to sell in some way, whether it's partial or full, but they want liquidity, they aren't going to be able to stay in it for whatever reason. I view this often as the second step. My preference is always, I love family-owned businesses. I love the story of multi-generationally owned businesses. It's super interesting, it's meaningful, and they've done a lot. But invariably, at some point, often families reach a point where they don't see that working, right? It's not going to work. This is a good interim step that admittedly I like because I like to see our communities thrive. And often those owners see a lot of value. They're getting enough proceeds that they're happy, but they also see value in making sure it stays in their community. All those investments they've made in people and the place are alive and well in the long term. And so those are the kinds of things that I think drive whether this is a good transition option for an owner, assuming they need to transition and they don't have another plan.
I think one thing that I would add to that would be is it does, just for the ESOP piece for a moment, is it does give a controllable exit in that you can control and stage your timeline with an ESOP. You can make a decision to do as Robert and Kramer have done and go to 40% and stay there. I've also worked with companies that have done 20, 40, 100 or something like that. And you have a buyer that always sits there to do the deal, which doesn't exist in most other instances. And so there can be times where that's really that type of control aspect for getting a transaction done can be really appealing for a variety of reasons. And also just the optionalities, as Robert alluded to, for where they sit, they have options to use the ESOP if they desired. If there was a shareholder that wanted that liquidity and it was everyone was comfortable with taking that step and going to a controlling transaction for the ESOP, that option always sits there as long as the capital planning is done and the funding is there. I think the earlier point that Drew made is a good one, and that's where you really start to think about where branches might get pruned from a potential decision tree. If you don't have a management team that can come in and run the business, and that sometimes we work with their CEOs, and I'm sure a lot of you that are listening know companies that are run that if the CEO left, the business has people that work in it, but the business itself is largely going to go away. And that can be a very hard transition for a lot of ownership models, and that you need either the buyer to be the person that can drive the business or for it to be sold to another entity that has that structure to facilitate operations post-sale. And so that can really be one of the key variables that can start to eliminate some options or require maybe a delay in the transition timeframe until you get a management team in place that can facilitate the type of transition that you're looking for.
I'm going to add one more thing because I'm sure Robert has a couple questions or comments on this too, but we do see this, and I know Nick and I have talked about this a lot, is there are family businesses where maybe there's 20 to 30% that might be owned by non-family members, right? And maybe a diverse group. So we see this a lot in community banks, for example, where having this buyer out there to provide liquidity is nice. It's a ready and willing buyer. It provides a market for a lot of those smaller employees that maybe you offered shares or grants to early on in their careers, stuff like that, where the other shareholders, the family shareholders, don't have to go out of pocket to make those purchases. The company can use the ESOP in a tax structured way to both provide liquidity to those non-family owners and also provide a benefit to employees going forward. And so it sort of replaces maybe the prior structure of we just gave shares directly. Now we're going to build it into this retirement plan model and maybe a more tax efficient and long-term structured way. So again, there's just lots of options. That's always a challenge. Focus on the goals, build the tools to get there.
Nick, I would just like to raise the question about what are some of the minimums or areas that a business owner needs to look at to say that they need to have a certain level of, for example, free cash flow, et cetera, that makes ESOP viable, because ESOP is not a viable option for every business out there.
That's absolutely true. And so it's important to note that we are talking about a qualified retirement plan. And so when you think about that, it's a little bit like a 401k. If you administer a 401k, you know it's not free. There are costs associated with it. There's also limitations that are set around the benefit that a retirement plan can provide relative to compensation, both at the individual and the company level. And so there's some just baseline thresholds that you need to pass to be viable as a standalone ESOP. Now, I will say we have helped companies transition to become part of larger ESOPs. So if you like the ownership model, that is a potential consideration if you're not quite large enough to be a standalone. Sometimes we see that you'll fit under, say, a holding company structure, and that could be a potential pathway alternative. And again, this is where starting at the beginning and thinking about the end for where you want to end up is so important in this conversation. There's almost always a pathway to get there, but your advisor can never set where you want to get to. They can only help facilitate the execution of you actually getting to where you want. But to get back to the question, if you really need to be to have a minimum of around a mid-20s employee count. I'm not going to be precise with the numbers here because there is some variance. And if you start being too much below $1 million in profit, it starts to get to be a possible and a viable ownership transition alternative, but it can be rather expensive to run. Now, you can get some tax benefits, especially if you make a full transition to becoming an ESOP, and that it's a retirement plan, so you can operate essentially on a tax-free basis if you make a full transition. But especially for a partial transition, Drew, I would be curious to hear your thoughts. But from where I said, for a partial transition, if you sit below that type of level, it's just expensive. And so those are really the two baseline items that I would say. I would note probably as well that if you're in a really high growth mode for your company, it's probably going to be more challenging to make this sale. One, because it's going to be hard for you to get the value that you probably think the business is worth if you're growing really rapidly. And two, generally speaking, high growth companies require cash. And the ESOP does not bring cash to the table to the company in this transaction. And so if you're in that type of growth mode and you have that type of cash requirement, it's not that it can't work. Just note that it might be a bit more challenging.
Yeah, I'd say basically what Nick says. I usually say 50 plus employees. You want a diversity. You don't want everyone to be 60 plus, like they're all going to retire and need liquidated.
The testing requirements go up. Yes, that's
right.
yes.
Things like that go.
Yes.
Now, some businesses, we see this with like some professional services like engineers or that. They can get away probably with a smaller business. There's not a lot of overhead, just stability is more manageable. But for what I'd call like the traditional core ESOP type companies, often are a manufacturer, distribution, dealers, like, mature businesses and industries, those tend to be, I usually say 50 employees but again, it really depends on your situation, but you want to have stability because at some point these retirees, when they want out of the plan, they retire. Well, what's the point of the stock in the plan if it can't turn into cash when they need it? So the company has an obligation to pay, like buy that stock back from the ESOP when people retire. And that means that there has to be a steady cash flow when that cash need comes. And there's lots of ways to try to manage that from the ESOP side, that repurchase obligation. But at the end of the day, I always tell people you're sort of starting a flywheel. And the hope is that the contributions are helping cover the repurchases and you want to roll that over time. And you have to have enough bodies and you need to have enough cash flow to facilitate that process.
Robert, what options did your family's business consider prior to implementing the ESOP?
I'm not sure since it wasn't around, but I do think that I think we are just different in that I do believe most ESOPs probably are thinking transition when they get started. Whereas in our case, we were really just thinking retirement plan. And so as a benefit to the employees and as a culture changer, so I think, and let me give it a little bit of explanation of how it worked. So we just started putting in contributions to employees, whether it was, I think it could go up to 15% of their wages of that year. For the last 20 years now, we've been at 5%, but I think in those earlier years, we could do a little more. But the big kicker is being an S Corp, the profit is going to the shareholders directly. So the Kramers would receive a K1 and, and it might distribute profit to them. The ESOP, now for a long time being 40% owner of the company, was getting 40% of the profit, was going straight to the ESOP and not paying any tax on it, and then grew in there, tax deferred. Inside, so that was the real kicker that was helping it grow quickly and getting some good balances for the employees. It also helps them every year. They're getting the statement to see, hey, my ESOP went up this much. Wow, this must be doing good. We must be doing something right here. Let's keep, working hard and trying to be more competitive. It's that whole culture part. But they also, within the ESOP is invested then in Kramer stock and other investments. In our case, about 50-50. I think the law might say primarily invested in the company stock. So we're a little bit more than 50% in Kramer stock. And then the other investments are more liquid. And we've been able to use that cash to pay out all the retirees, even though some have had some pretty significant balances. We've been able to use that cash to pay them out and never had to redeem the stock, or as Drew mentioned. So
the ESOP had the dollars. That's good.
Yeah. So it's just been, in our minds, it was instead of a 401k. And a couple of times we even asked our employees, well, would you want us to also have 401k? And they said, no, we'd rather you put more money into the ESOP, rather than starting another retirement plan. So with that mindset, I believe that's what they were after, Deborah, was the retirement plan, and then the way that this could affect the culture over time.
Thanks, Robert. So as we talk about partial ESOPs and the thought process as you're considering a partial ESOP, next step then would be, well, what are the tactical aspects of implementing an ESOP? For example, who needs to be involved? How should the ESOP be implemented? Nick, would you like to start off with what are the key steps of implementing an ESOP from Prairie Capital's standpoint?
Sure. So we definitely work with firms, both the company and on the other side for the buy side, which we'll touch on here shortly as well, for what this transition process looks like. And I think really from a framing perspective, you can think about this largely as an M&A process, but we just have a captive single buyer. By the time we're actually entering the process and fully starting it. Now, some companies will look at both. And so it's not uncommon if there's interest in seeing what potential alternatives there are for a sale at the same time you're considering a transition to the ESOP, that you can look at both. But to narrow the scope of the question and just talk about an ESOP transaction here for a moment, typically what is going to start is when you go to an advisor, you're going to look at whether or not it's feasible. And feasibility means it's a little bit what Drew and I were going back and forth on. Does your company functionally fit for an ESOP as an ownership structure type? There's limitations on how concentrated the benefit can be. Do you have enough employees? But also when you think about post-transaction, you want to look at, can the business cash flow the transaction? And so I'm going to skip ahead here for a moment for context for that. But the way that one of these transactions happens is, let's say that we're doing a 40% deal. So I have a business worth $1,000. I'm selling 40% of it, $400 transaction. There's no cash that's brought to the table by anyone for this deal. And so in the simplest format, if Robert is the seller and he owns all of the business, he's functionally going to lend, and I'm waving my hand at a few things here, but he's functionally going to lend the ESOP $400 to get the deal done. And then the company is going to repay that money to Robert over time. Now, there's different ways that this gets structured, but that's the basic structure. And so the proceeds that Robert receives from sale are functionally from the company repaying the transaction debt, with the ESOP ending up with the equity ownership. So there's a little bit of complexity there for how that works, and there's some steps to the process. But really the important takeaway in thinking about it for this conversation is, if you're going to sell that $400 for the 40%, can the company support that debt load? Now it becomes an even bigger question if we look at 100%. But there can be times that you're going through a meaningful expansion. Do you have the balance sheet capacity to facilitate that sale? So that's a type of thing that a feasibility looks at. It also looks into the future and says, do the dynamics of the company support the ability to repurchase those shares that both Drew and Robert were talking about for the cash needs that are going to go into the plan for the participants over time? Can the operations support that moving forward? And so before you get too far into the process, it's important to have a good look at that conversation and to have someone assess the feasibility of the ownership transition as an alternative, because it may be that that's where the conversation for this path of the decision tree ends and that proves not to be viable. Once we get past that stage, what we're going to look at is bringing some professional advisors in. And so, Drew, we'll go back and forth on this. I'll take us up close to the deal, and then you can walk us through the deal process from an attorney perspective. And so what's going to happen at that point is you're going to work with typically an advisor. Sometimes it'll be a sell-side advisor. Sometimes it'll be your attorney, depending on who's best set up and suited to lead the transition. And you're going to find the trustee. And this is where I have to step back and talk about ESOPs for just a second. And that ESOPs will have for a transaction, again, waving my hand at some nuance, an external trustee that acts as a fiduciary for the plan and whose sole purpose is to act in the best interest of the participants of the plan. And so when you are selling a business, the trustee functionally sits on the other side of the table to represent the buyer. They are going to hire a financial advisor. And so that financial advisor is going to construct a valuation range and assist the trustee in negotiation and do their independent assessment of the feasibility of the deal. And that's often where Prairie Capital will come in and either help the seller or the buyer in this case. And then you have a normal negotiation back and forth on price. So Drew, I'll stop talking for a little bit if you want to jump in and maybe take us across the finish line from that point.
If I could just ask one more question, Nick, because you mentioned that many times with a partial ESOP, the owner would then essentially be the financier, that the ESOP would be buying over time those shares from the owner using company operation cash flow. What happens if a situation is such that the owner is not in a position, they need that liquidity right away? What's the viability, the ease of external funding so that the ESOP is able to buy those shares from the owner?
Great
and
question,
cash
Devin.
is available right away.
So most ESOP transactions, especially minority, it's almost more common that it will be bank debt, because a bank will come in and lend up to a specific amount of cash flows. A lot of banks will do cash flow based lending. If you have assets in the business, you can even structure it against those assets. So I was using that, the simplest example. And some sellers, especially right now, are like, I know my company incredibly well. I'll lend them money at 9% and be happy all day long to clip that coupon and receive a return on it and be able to do the tax piece on it. A lot of times though, the bank will come in, and if it's a minority ESOP, they might finance all of it. And so the seller would actually receive all the cash at that time. If it's a 100% deal, you're not going to find a bank that's going to do 100%, but a lot of times they'll come in, and a general rule of thumb is between like 1.5 to 2.5 turns of EBITDA. The bank will come in and they'll finance to that level times profit. And then the rest, generally speaking, again, waving my hand at a bit of nuance, is then the seller would finance the rest. And so that you can give some liquidity up front and then some seller note over time, but minority can oftentimes just be the bank. And then the seller gets liquidity.
And that's a good example of not necessarily that different from a third-party sale, right? When I represent buyers, I often want that seller, especially if there's a blue sky component, which there often is, Goodwill and others, I want them to either be carrying something back, putting it into an escrow, other types of things to protect and make sure that the business is going to go. But I think it gets back to what Nick said earlier. Fundamentally, all the financing sources, whether it's the seller, a bank, some other structured lender, is all going to be looking to the company for where they're lending. They're not lending directly to the ESOP, because the ESOP doesn't have much, right? I mean, it has the stock that it is borrowing the money to buy, and that's it to start. Like, that's not a great creditor or a debtor. No one would lend against that, but they might lend against the company, because that's really where the buck stops. So the company's creditworthiness, if it's already got a ton of debt, guess what? There's not going to be much room on that balance sheet for additional debt for seller payments. But if it's debt-free, there's likely, especially with a consistent operating history, there's going to be availability of potentially partial bank financing or others. So much like you'd look at if you were trying to borrow money for any other reason, that's going to factor into those decisions. And people are going to look to the company as the borrower on those things.
So this may be a viable option, especially for family businesses as they're moving to the next generation and there's family members that really don't want to be part of the family and others that do. This is a way to meet the needs of the needs of both those who want to remain with the business and those who want the liquidity.
And it's impossible to avoid rabbit holes here completely in this conversation, even saying it a little bit.
and Nick and I both like rabbit holes, to be
Yes,
clear.
yes.
So
We could get
last
into
one
those
beer,
for sure.
we'll go down as many as you want.
But the one thing there is, especially, and Robert talked about this a little bit, in that they put significant cash into the plan. And so if you're making transition planning over time, there is that pathway where you can put cash in the plan. You can get the advantageous tax treatment sometimes, especially through contributions, to put cash in the plan. And if you build that, that can actually facilitate additional share purchases without needing to rely on seller debt or external bank financing. Now, again, like most things we're talking about, there's some nuance related to the execution there. But it can be, especially for managing a shareholder base, a very attractive option. And it's something that we see some firms that have a more dispersed shareholder base, banks being the easiest example, that it provides a really good, call it equity or capital stack management tool.
There's always some like 0.01% holder who dies and they want to be bought out. And like, it's just annoying. Like, it's nice to have the buyer there.
Yes. So that takes us about to the stage where we really start the negotiation piece and really kind of the nuts and bolts of the transaction process. So Drew, would be curious from an attorney's perspective to hear a little bit of that walkthrough for what it looks like.
Yeah, what I tell people is you build your own buyer. Like, it's the only transaction structure I'm aware of where like you build the buyer. And so let's just say you're 100% seller, or you're an owner who owns 100% and you're going to set up an ESOP to buy something. Doesn't matter what percentage, but we'll just say that we'll use the 40% example Nick used. I get to choose as the business owner, and I'm a controlling shareholder, what the terms of the plan are, how quickly they're going to get benefits. Like, there's lots of choices in ESOP, just like there is in any other retirement plan. And as the company and the controlling shareholder, like, you choose that benefit. However, shockingly enough, when you are acting, this ESOP is supposed to be acting in the best interest of the employees. The Department of Labor and IRS look at it and say, wait, the seller who's going to sell these shares and price them is the same side of both these transactions. That looks a little shady, or it could be shady, right? So they're going to make that independent trustee that Nick noted be on the other side of the transaction. So you also are picking who you negotiate against. And you don't actually want one that's a complete pushover, right? You're just begging for trouble, but you want one that's reasonable, fair, and effective. And they're going to pick their own set of advisors. The company's going to pay for your advisors as the seller. They're going to pay for the ESOP's advisors. So a lot of people are like, my gosh, there's a lot of costs going into this. I would say yes, like you're going to pay more in what I'd call like traditional advisor costs, lawyers, accountants, the financial advisors, maybe. But you'll often avoid some sort of like percentage deal fee on a broker, for example, or investment banker if you were to sell. So like, I don't know that the net costs are actually that different from a third party sale. But just recognize that if it's like, all I care about is say legal fees or accounting fees, like you're going to pay double because you're paying for both sides as the company, generally speaking. With that said, again, there's advantages to building your own buyer. There's some tax advantages, but the structure goes, there's some back and forth negotiation. It needs to be arm's length. There's going to be appraisals of the value. Like the trustee is going to hire a valuation expert to confirm that the price you land at is within the range of fair market value. They cannot pay by law more than fair market value. And that is, I'd call it, there's a lot of debate right now, and there's proposed legislation on how to define this, but functionally it's a buyer and a seller under no compulsion to sell with perfect information would agree, right? That this is like a fair value, and they're aiming sort of for what I call the average of the mean, right? So we're not looking for the tail, the best possible price. We're not looking for the worst possible price. We're looking for a fair price, sort of down the middle. So I know Nick does some of that valuation kind of work. But that process usually takes, we'll say 2 to 3 months. There'll be a term sheet. There'll be back and forth on pricing, key terms, what have you. Often the trustee is going to have some requirements for governance, depending on how big of the purchase is going to be. So for example, if they're a minority, the 40%, they often don't expect to have control of the company, but they're often going to want 1 or 2 maybe independent directors to join their board. I've even done one recently where it's 100% transaction, but the family still controls the board of directors. There's a handful of things they're limited from doing without the consent of the independent directors. For example, they can't just double their own pay overnight, right? They got to go get consent from the independent directors. But except for those conflict transactions, the family still controls the business in pretty much every meaningful way, both in their day-to-day jobs, they're still working in the business, and they have a majority of the board of directors. So there's lots of those things that get negotiated on a go-forward basis, both for that transaction and thinking ahead about what governance looks like.
And I don't think you disagree. So just one other thing I'll throw in on that before we move on. But Drew, I think there's probably almost more things that are similar to a traditional, call it M&A sale process, than there are things that are different here. And so there's some nuances that it's important to understand the context of, but it really is more of a nuance than the general thrust of the sale process here. Independent buyer, independent seller, you got to agree on a price and terms. I mean, and the timelines don't look all that different either. And so I think it's important just not to get lost in the conversation, and that there's
I think that's exactly right. Like there's due diligence. The trustee has an obligation as a fiduciary to make sure that they're buying the real thing. So just like if you were selling to a third-party P&E firm and they do due diligence, the trustee is going to do due diligence. All the things that they want to talk to management. They want to make sure you have a plan for management. Like all of those things are things that any buyer would want. And the trustee is going to basically behave like any other buyer. And you'll just have some additional maybe documentation. There might be some structural hoops we jump through to get to a very similar result to what you would expect in a traditional transaction.
So I'd like to direct this question to Robert. A little bit of what was your company's experience with the implementation of an ESOP, but as Nick and Drew talked quite a bit about trustee, I'd like to, if you would be willing to share a little bit of your experience and how you interact with your trustee and how your firm selected the trustee, et cetera.
Yeah, so I've just been kind of amazed that my dad had this foresight in 1978, to do this, because he wasn't really thinking about transition. But it does beg the question, if I were in a more of a newer business today, why would I have a 401k instead of an ESOP? I mean, if you're in that position where you're not going to transition until 30 years from now, that's the great time to start. That's the best time to start. If you would take monies that you were going to put into their 401k and instead put it into their employees' ESOP, there's just some great synergies, things that could happen. And then 30 years from now, you'll be where we are, where we have this great financial foundation that my dad left for us. So he did that both in the ESOP and just in the company, having a company that's well grounded and no debt, just some good foundational things that he left for this next generation that was really some good foresight. The trustee, oh, by the way, I make it sound like we're all this altruistic, for the employees, but my cousin and I are the largest, ESOP participants. We have the life because I looked around the other day and realized we've been around longer than anybody else in the company. So the longer you stay in and you get the contributions and then the compounding, all of a sudden, he and I are the two largest accounts, in the plan. So it's helping me retire a little earlier, if I could ever get away from this place. So, but the trustee, we've had a really good relationship. Give a little shout out to Great Bank. The only negative thing about him is that I can't pronounce Scott's last name, but it's a storage.
You're not alone. We all have our own way, and we're just calling them right. I like it.
So Scott S. does a great job. We so the board, had made the decision to select them. On the other hand, the trustees are voting 40% of the count of the shares when it comes to our annual meeting. We get together and vote who the shareholders vote who the board is going to be. Now, so far, they've always agreed with us, hey, this is who we think the board should be, and we've voted together, and there hasn't been any conflict. I would say they would probably, if we asked them, their number one recommendation probably would be to have an outside person on our board, and that's not a totally bad idea. But other than that, they then go out and hire a company. They've been hiring HTH to do the annual appraisal, and they get input from us, and we try to get to that fair price, because some people are going out and they want the highest price, and those people who are staying want to be the lowest price. So what is that fair price? And working through those little details has always been a pretty good process, and we really haven't had any troubles.
And I think it's an important point to clarify, because it's a common source of confusion around control and what it means to have a trustee. And that a lot of times when companies make this transition, even if they make a control transition, one of the initial things that they're always leery of is really that what it means for the trustee to own control. And the easiest way to start that conversation is it's really not that dissimilar from what Robert just described, and that the trustee is going to be involved in the board of directors selection. And they're going to want to, for some things, they're going to want to be asked for consent, but that's not going to touch on anything operationally or budgetary or tactical for the company, and that the trustee doesn't want involvement in that. They're not set up to be involved in that. And so those type of day-to-day operating decisions, even if you're talking about a control transaction, which is not where Kramer's at, it's a similar type of conversation. The difference is if they go to a control, they're probably going to want outside board members to be involved, and that's probably going to be a requirement of the deal. But just wanted to highlight that they're really there in support of the business. And across the 7 years that I've been working with ESOPs, I don't need all the fingers on one hand to where there's really been true conflict between the trustee and the board when it comes to control issues.
That is the biggest thing. And this was from someone who was very opposed to doing ESOP and never did do it. But he goes, why would I want to let the inmates run the asylum, right? He seemed to have this belief that it just meant every employee was going to be sitting in the CEO's office, like telling them everything they're doing wrong and having a say on everything. And that is just functionally not how it works. At the end of the day, the board still makes the decision. They are a pretty passive shareholder in a lot of ways. They care about who those directors are. They care about management. They want some reporting to make sure they're doing their duties. But I have yet to run across a trustee who wanted to be getting daily reports and had thoughts on all of this. And the employees are not, like, it's indirect ownership for the employees. The plan is the owner for the benefit of employees, but the employees are not the direct owners.
And I think that's probably the second biggest misconception, is that they're the beneficial owners of the trust. They're not direct shareholders. So if you know the shareholder requirements for what you have to disclose, they don't apply here. And so, Robert, I'm curious just what you choose to share with employees, and would ask that the only thing that you have to share is what the share price is, really functionally, for the ESOP. There's very few other things that are actually required for you to share.
Yeah, we so annually, have that appraisal each year, and then after that gets done, then they're going to do there's a company who does all the math to figure out every participant's balance. And when you talked about costs of running the ESOP, by the way, these costs are coming out of the plan, so it's not coming out of the company funds, but out of the ESOP's fund. So then they get a statement in about just a few weeks ago. So about June of each year, each participant receives, this statement that says, okay, this is what your account was before, and this is what it is now. But really beyond that, when we talk about ESOP, we're just kind of giving them updates about how the company's doing and how important it is and how important they are. And in this whole how they can affect the bottom line, how they can have an impact, and it's all about that. So yeah, we don't send them out, balance sheets or income statements. We're just talking, just big general, is it a good year? What work do we have on hand? And then here's your balance.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say on that is open book sometimes gets grouped with ESOP. It's not the same as ESOP. You can be open book without an ESOP. You can be open book with an ESOP. You can be an ESOP without open book type management for what you share. They're oftentimes they go together, but they definitely don't have to.
Very good, Kevin. I was going to ask about transparency, and Drew, you had mentioned that one of the issues that you hear often is related to control. Is transparency and sharing the open book of financials another aspect that you will hear from clients as they're evaluating an ESOP?
Yes, and like Nick said, a different question, right? Like that is something you can do. There's certain levels. And there are some required disclosures, but they're fairly minimal to the actual employees, right? It's the statement. So think of, you get your annual 401k statement, and you probably get more than that for a 401k, but for the ESOP, you're going to get an annual statement. This is what you own. This is your value. This is what was contributed this year, those kinds of things. And that's really the big piece that is required to be disclosed.
Right.
A lot of people decide to do more because they want to lean into that ownership culture that Robert mentioned and otherwise.
It's voluntary. It's a choice that the organization wants to make. So as a company looks at the possibilities for the transition, and they look at implementing, and they do implement an ESOP, what should they expect after the implementation? What changes? What stays the same? How do they prepare their new employee owners?
I would just throw out there, I would just throw out there that there is, to be good at it, it should take some effort on management to really, it's the communication piece.
Yeah.
So as talking about it multiple times a year, helping answering questions, helping employees understand, and helping them to really get this this culture part that I've been talking about of how their actions affect the ESOP.
Yeah, and that's it. And it's a little bit the same as the financial disclosures. If you don't want anything to change after you put an ESOP in, you can just mail the statements every year, and that's all you do. And it doesn't have to really, there's nothing that says that much has to change. If you want to get the benefit and have the buy-in that Robert's discussed, Kramer building, over the last 4 decades, you're going to have to put in some additional work, because a lot of people otherwise are not going to understand. They don't understand sometimes the 401k, what it means to have stock ownership. They're really not going to understand what an ESOP means without some concerted effort from the company to facilitate just disseminating that knowledge.
Right. I had nothing to add for those excellent comments.
Okay. Well,
For
Robert,
once.
I would just ask, as you mentioned some of the things, what obstacles did Kramer face after the conversion? And I realize that your conversion happened, like you said, when you were pre-teen, but
I think he's getting allocations at age 11, it sounds like. He's
Yeah.
sweeping the floors in between shifts.
Yeah, might have been get some. Yeah, I don't know of any that they really ran into. There's been a lot of the ESOP laws, change over time, and so we do work closely with NIMASTER is our consultant attorney for ESOP questions, and so they're helping us redo the plan or do these modifications to comply with the law. But in general, the operation from our office here has been pretty smooth and kind of event free.
right. As we finish up this afternoon, I'd like to ask each one of you to share your key takeaways, or a piece of information that you want to make sure gets communicated to our audience today that maybe we haven't mentioned already. And I'll start with you, Nick.
I would say that the key thing is give yourself time, if at all possible, to plan out a transition. the closer that you start a transition process to actually needing to complete it, generally speaking, the less likely you are to be satisfied with where you end up. And the sooner that you start the conversations, even if you're not ready, and emotional readiness is a real thing when it comes to being able to part with ownership. But the sooner that you start the conversation and the more time you give to explore options, generally speaking, the more likely you are to get a result that you're going to end up being happy with and that your family will be happy with.
Drew?
Yeah, I would like to end with sort of the idea sort of mentioned earlier is, I think this is one of those things where if I just search ESOP online, I get wildly conflicting and often very poor guidance about what it means or what it would mean for me. And I have come to believe, I'm a little bit of a true believer, maybe drank the Kool-Aid a little bit, but as someone who works with tons and tons of family businesses, and as I already mentioned, my first priority is I like to keep them in the family, but I know, and any family knows that may not be true forever. I want them to know that there's intermediate options besides just selling to private equity. And I've seen that it often meets the values that these families have better than the alternatives. And so if you're a fit otherwise, and you realize you have to sell or some portion is going to sell, I think this is the great in between for many families to preserve legacy, community, family, and many, many things beyond just the exact dollar value. Because I like I said, in Iowa, almost all the business owners I work with, they do care deeply about those things. And they don't even know it's on the map for them. So that's what I'd tell people is it may not be for you, it may not be now, but if the time came where some portion was to be sold, to know that this is an option.
And Robert?
And by the way, I gave a plug to NIMASTER. I will give a plug to Brown Winnick that we do use Brown Winnick in all of our real estate stuff and business stuff.
So you just can't get away from us is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, exactly. So, really kind of a combination of those two. I asked the question, a win-win to me is if you're even thinking about your 20, 30 years, 40 years from now, the time, if you could start now is great. And if you can take money that you're already giving to a retirement plan and now just shift it over and put it into an ESOP, I think it gives you more options down the road to have for transition and even, like I said, helping yourself as being one of the employees. So I'd say if you're giving any thought at all, I would pursue it and contact some of these folks about getting some expert advice on it.
Right. Well, thank you. Katie, do we have any questions, or I should say, anyone have any questions for our panelists before we close this webinar?
We do not have any in the chat, but I'd like to open it up and see if Dan has any final questions for the family business sphere.
I don't really have any questions. I think what we wanted to do today was give an outline and then kind of just a first step toward that process type of a presentation, which I think we very much did. And I really appreciate Robert being on with us today to kind of give a firsthand account. I think that's where it really is always appreciated from our families, is hearing from other families. And, I would say too, that maybe some of the reasons that you might be looking at an ESOP initially might change. They already have for me just listening to this conversation. So the things that might hook you in initially are probably not the things that are going to keep you in it longer term, or that are going to make you actually go down that path, it sounds like to me. So I appreciate Nick and Drew giving that perspective as well about get sucked into the tax consequences and things like that, but consider the much larger pieces of why you're deciding to do this. So thanks to everybody.
I'm actually impressed Nick and I managed to avoid all Internal Revenue Code references today. Like that takes a lot of restraint from both of us.
No, nobody wanted to hear that either. So
No, they didn't. I know. Like I know my audience here, and the answer is we don't want to hear that.
Dan, that doesn't always change whether or not it comes up, though, just because nobody wants to hear it.
That's true.
That's the next level of discussion as someone is looking at an ESOP, partial or full, as they evaluate the positives, the pros and the cons of making that transition. Certainly, the IRS and the tax code are a key aspect of their decision process. And I think we've emphasized today that the planning, the implementation, and being aware of what happens afterwards are critical. And that in many ways, the real work begins as you implement that partial ESOP, and that the integration is the key to the success. And I would just like to say that, well, first of all, thank you to Nick and Drew and Robert for your willingness to be on this panel today. And I want to encourage all of our attendees to certainly reach out to Nick or Drew, Robert, reach back to the Family Business Center, to Dan and Katie, to reach out to me and the rest of the Iowa CEO team. We exist to provide information and education, knowledge, and make connections regarding employee ownership models. And today we were specifically talking about ESOPs. I would also encourage you, as Drew said, there is a lot of information out there, and some of it is conflicting. However, we do have some strong proponents of employee ownership, specifically ESOPs, in the Iowa-Nebraska chapter of the ESOP Association. And there's some wonderful people that are part of ESOP organizations in Iowa that are very willing to share what they know and what they've learned over time about ESOPs. So there's lots of resources out there. We're all available to help out where we can. So again, I'd like to thank you for attending today, and I'll just make one plug for the Iowa Center for Employee Ownership, that we have our annual Employee Ownership Conference coming up in October, actually October 16th in Ankeny at the FFA Enrichment Center. So I would encourage you to consider attending that. Registration will open in August. Again, thank you today. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of our attendees. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.